So let's try that. Hey, look at that. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for telling us, Marilyn. We appreciate that. So if you're watching on the live stream, and I know there are a few people who are right now, welcome. We're glad to have you. You really missed nothing important at all. We're just glad to have you here. So we're in chapter 3 today, and we're taking a look at the last 3 letters that Christ dictates to John, and these letters are supposed to be read to the church. So here we go. Revelation is apocalyptic. That means that it is a prophetic book, a prophetic work, just like Daniel. There are 2 ways, if you remember, that prophecy is used in the Bible. One of those means is to refer to a person who speaks to God's people on behalf of God, and we call those people prophets. So the gift of prophecy, in one way that it is used in the Bible, means that someone has an office. In the Old Testament, there were 3 official offices in the theocratic society of Israel. Theocratic means God is the head of the government in Israel. There is the office of the prophet, the priest, and the king. The king rules on behalf of God, the priest goes to God on behalf of the people, and the prophet goes to the people on behalf of God. There is prophecy in the New Testament, but those offices don't exist in the same way because Christ is prophet, priest, and king. So Christ is the prophet, Christ is the high priest and the King of kings and Lord of lords. So Christ fulfills all of those duties in the New Testament. That doesn't mean that there is no prophecy. The gift of prophecy still works itself out in the New Testament church, just in a different way than it did in the Old Testament. So one way to look at that is prophecy means that God has called a person to speak to God's people on behalf of God. God gives that person a message, and the person relays the message to God's people. But there's another way to talk about prophecy. We talked about this just a little bit, and we're just kind of catching up right now. And that is to take a look at what will happen in the future. That version of prophecy is the one that we are most familiar with, because when we think about prophecy from a secular perspective, we think about people like Nostradamus, whom the History Channel is putting on documentaries about all the time. People who believe that they have been able to tell what will come in the future. Now, we know that there are some limitations to that because of free will, but we also know that God has free will. So while God gives you the authority to make certain decisions about how your life will go, and we've talked about that, I have authority to make some decisions. I don't have authority over everything that I could possibly decide to do. For instance, I can decide reasonably whether I will walk around on the stage or stay in one place. Now, if you know me, you know that there's really no decision for me there at all. But I can decide that. I can decide whether I'm going to move or stay put. I cannot decide to create life out of nothing. I don't have that authority. I don't have that ability. So there are some things I can choose to do. There are other things I cannot choose to do because I don't have the authority to do it. That means that I participate in determining what my future will be, because God has given me authority over certain things. I cannot determine the entirety of my future because I do not have authority over all things. But I can participate in that with God because I have authority over some things. For instance, I have authority over what I will do for lunch today. In fact, I'm picking up Kate and Megan, and we're all going to go out to lunch together unless something changes. Why? Because we decided to do that this morning. We can make those decisions within reasonable constraints. I cannot make certain decisions about my future within the realm of control that I don't have. So God will determine certain things about my life that I cannot determine. For instance, God has determined that my life will be finite, at least here on earth. I can't make that determination. God has determined that in Him I can live forever. I can't make that determination either, right? So there are certain things that I can decide, certain things I can't. So when we're talking about prophecy, that becomes mildly problematic because I have a role to play in this. I get to help to participate in how the direction of history goes as it unfolds throughout the scope of time. And so do you. What you decide has an influence on the way that history will unfold throughout the scope of time. The way that our decisions interact with one another also have an influence on how things will go. That is why the story of Eden focuses so heavily on the fact that humanity broke the world. The reason humanity broke the world is because we decided to do what only God can do, which is to make decisions about what is right. We can't make decisions about what is right because we don't have ultimate authority and we don't have complete knowledge. God has those things. So when we talk about prophecy and how it's used, especially in this context, we're talking about something very specific, and that is the fact that while, yes, you and I have free will, so does God. And God is the only being in all of creation who has total and complete authority and total and complete knowledge. That means we usually say God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. That means God knows everything. God is all-powerful, has all authority, all power, and God is present everywhere. There's nothing God doesn't know. There's no place God is not. So here's what that means. God can say, here is how everything will end. Why can God say that? Because God is the only being in all of creation who has the power to make whatever God chooses happen. So if God says, this is how things will end, that is how things will end, because God will make it so. I couldn't do that. I couldn't say, here's how everything will end, because I don't have the power to make that happen. God does. That is the kind of prophecy that we're taking a look at here in the New Testament. Not that we're not looking at somebody who is saying this will happen because it's already been written outside of time. What we're seeing is that Christ is saying to John, this will happen because it's already been decided by God that it will be this way. So much of Revelation deals with that apocalyptic prophecy. So there are a couple of words that are important to know. Apocalypse is one of them, and that is a bit more of a secular way to refer to eschatology. Eschatology is the theological term for the end of all things. In particular, when we talk about eschatology or the eschatological work of God, we're talking about how God is going to bring about the coming of the new kingdom, the new Jerusalem, new heaven, and the new earth, how God will reconcile all of creation back toward what God originally intended for us to be. One of the interesting things about the Scriptures and our interaction with them is that we have a tendency as people to focus on the salvation of humanity and our individual humanity. But time and time and time again, over and over and over again, what we see in the Scriptures is not just the salvation of humanity. It's the reconciliation of all creation to what God intended. God cares about us, for sure. We are created in the image of God, for sure. Created to be stewards of all that God has given us, for sure. In fact, you're going to hear me talk some about that on Sunday. But when Christ is talking so frequently about what God intends to do, he's talking about the reconciliation of creation so that the kingdom of God rules on earth. All of creation is reconciled to God. God is intent on making sure that everything God has created is back in right relationship with God again. That's what eschatology means. So secularly, we talk about apocalypse or apocalyptic work. Theologically, the word is eschatology or eschatological means the same thing. So I'll use those interchangeably, and I just want you to know what that means. That is the kind of prophecy we're talking about. The first chapter gives us a bit of an introduction to that. John falls into this kind of trance. He's been exiled to the island of Patmos. He falls into this kind of trance on the Lord's Day. We talked a little bit about the Lord's Day and how that was created in contrast to Caesar's Day, or the day of the emperor. So John falls into a trance on the Lord's Day. Christ appears to him, as does an angel of the Lord, and then we begin to see Christ starting to dictate all of these letters to the 7 churches. The 7 churches, again, remember, are 7 cities on this road that goes in a circle, and they're very influential cities. There are churches in each of these cities, but it's important to remember that each of these letters dictated to John by Christ are meant to be read in all of the churches. Every church is meant to hear all of the letters. And so while we kind of encounter Revelation with this, as you heard me say, we see it kind of as an enigmatic kind of a letter. It was the most widely circulated book in the early church, more so than the Gospels, more so than the epistles. Why? Because prophecy intrigues us. We want to know what's going to happen, especially if any part of any prophecy comes to be proven true, then that intrigues us even more. That's never changed for humanity. So when Revelation begins to circulate in the early church, people are intrigued by it. Here is what God is saying is going to happen. And you've got to remember that around the time this is being written, there's still a widely held belief that Christ will return in their lifetime. So they're very interested in this. Peter is going around and preaching abstinence, that people should not get married, that there should be no procreation because Christ is coming again, and He's going to come again in our lifetime. So we should make a complete and utter devotion of ourselves to Christ. To the point that many wives, many women left their husbands, and many husbands got very angry with Peter. His life was in jeopardy because of that at one point. So then, as you know from reading the writings of Paul, the theology of the church changes. Why? Because people start to die and Christ has not returned yet. So Paul's theology changes. That's really the best example we have of that in the Scriptures because Paul did so much writing over such a long period of time. And we see his theology change from Christ is coming back while we're still alive to maybe we need to have a little bit longer view of things. And you start hearing Paul talking about running races and enduring and things like that. So the early church needed to lengthen their view, lengthen their theology. Look out a little bit further than they were currently looking. We have the opposite problem. We tend to fall into the trap of believing that because it's been so long, it's going to be so long before Christ comes again. We need to remember that Christ has said that no one will know. It could very easily happen in our lifetime. So while much of this book is prophetic, apocalyptic, eschatological, talks about what God has decided will happen and how things will end, that's really a misnomer because what God has decided is not how things will end. It's how things will be reconciled and the world will begin again. While that's what interests us about Revelation, what we find from Christ, especially in these letters, is eminently practical. The advice that Christ is giving to these churches is advice we should be paying attention to today. We saw that in the first 4 letters that we looked at last week. We're going to see it again in the 3 letters that we're going to read about today. Now, once we get past these letters, we get some some language used by John that presents these excellent images. There's been a lot written about whether this is metaphorical or literal and how are we to interpret it. One of the best scholars to have written about Revelation that I read has said that you need to be really careful of over-interpreting Revelation lest you miss the picture that John's words are painting, because it's a powerful picture. It's a powerful image. So we're going to finish up these letters today, chapter 3. We're going to see some more of Christ's practical admonition to the churches, which applies, I believe, still to us today. And then we're going to get on with some of the prophetic imagery that happens next week, chapter 3. So write this to the angel of the church in Sardis. These are the words of the one who holds God's 7 spirits and 7 stars. Now remember, from chapter 1, there's this imagery, right? Christ has got these 7 stars in his hand, and there are 7 lampstands. The 7 stars represent the angels of the churches. The 7 lampstands represent the churches. Again, a lot of discussion about whether or not that idea that there are angels for each church is supposed to be literal or a metaphor. It could work either way. One of my favorite theologians, when he was talking about scriptural interpretation, always used to say, don't get too caught up in those kinds of interpretations, because most of the time, no matter which way you go, it doesn't change the meaning of the message at all. If we were to decide that, for instance, the idea that there are 7 angels or angels for each of the churches is a metaphor, as some scholars say, and that idea that Christ is writing to an angel really means that Christ is writing to the bishop of the church or the metaphorical spirit of the church or all of the people. If we were to decide that, versus if we were to decide that there is actually an angel who oversees that church, does it change the meaning of the letter that's been written? That's the question we have. My opinion is that it doesn't change it at all. The Scripture is replete with references to the work of angels in the world, that they work under the direction of God, that they are absolutely very much present. The Scriptures even say, Paul says, that we will judge them at the end of all things, that humans will judge angels. Look for that. Every time I bring that up, people don't believe me that it's there. So look for it. You'll find it. You can read it. That's what the Scriptures say. But there was also a growing cult of angelic worship in the early church. And so because of that, ever since then, the larger body of the church has been really careful not to put too much emphasis on what we understand, the limited amount of knowledge we have about angels, which comes from the Scriptures, lest we reconstitute that cult of angelic worship that was really powerful in the early church for a while. So, does it matter? I don't know that it does. These are the words of the one who holds God's 7 spirits and the 7 stars. I know your works. You have a reputation of being alive, and you are in fact dead. Wake up, strengthen whatever you have left, tethering on the brink of death. For I have found that your works are far from complete in the eyes of my God. So remember what you received and heard. Hold on to it and change your hearts and lives. If you don't wake up, I will come like a thief. We've heard that before. I will come like a thief in the night. And you won't know what time I will come upon you. But you do have a few people in Sardis who haven't stained their clothing. They will walk with me clothed in white because they are worthy. Those who emerge victorious will wear white clothing like this. I won't scratch out their names from the scroll of life, but will declare their names in the presence of my Father and his angels. If you can hear, listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. All right, let's take a look at that letter. Sardis is wealthy. It's a city that is incredibly wealthy. They're also known for creating they actually claim to have been the first city to have created commercial dyes. So they dye clothing. They're well known for that. It is a wealthy city. When Christ is writing to this church, he says, you have the reputation of being alive, but you are in fact dead. So Sardis is a great example of a church that is thriving and doing really, really well. But in the midst of that thriving, in the midst of that doing really, really well, Christ is saying, as big as you are, as wealthy as you are, as many people as you have coming, you are in fact dead, and you don't even know it. Sardis had a reputation for bringing lots of people in, but they also had a reputation for embracing the secular way of life. And so we've seen this theme. In each of the letters that Christ has dictated, we've seen this theme that it is not okay to be of the world, right? Christ has said during Christ's ministry on earth that we are to be in the world, but not of the world. And so now Christ is appearing to John, and he's dictating these letters, and in just about every instance, there's one letter we're going to read about today where Christ doesn't say anything bad to them at all. But in just about every Christ is saying, it is not okay for you to give up on what I have taught you and embrace what you are experiencing in the secular world that you live in. Christ is saying over and over again that to follow me is to be countercultural. To follow me is to be different. So here in this letter, we have some advice from Christ, which is more an admonition, I guess, than advice, that is eminently practical. What he's saying, if we were going to translate that to modern terms today, is the metrics that you are using to measure success don't count. It does not matter how big you are. It does not matter in terms of attendance size. It doesn't matter how big you are as a church. It doesn't matter how wealthy you are as a church. You are not actually doing anything that matters. There are a number of scholars who were trying to figure out if this idea of death had more to do with their spiritual fervor or with their works, what they're accomplishing. So there's been a lot written about that, and in summary, this is what most scholars have come to. Because Sardis so heavily embraced the secular culture, in order to do that, they had to abandon some of the things that Christ taught them. They had to abandon some of the practices that set them apart from the culture that they lived in, so that they were living as a church that essentially embraced much of what the secular world said they were supposed to do, said was okay. Christ says the opposite. Christ says that to follow Christ, we have to take up our cross, that we will be persecuted, that we were to be in the world but not of the world. Sardis was in the world and was of the world, and Christ was not going to have any of that. So what is the message for us today? We have to be careful about the metrics that we use to measure success. Christ does care about what we do. Not just what we believe, but what we do. We know that we can't earn our way into heaven, but neither does that mean that what we do doesn't matter. That's a major fallacy of grace-based religion, that while you can't earn your way into heaven, so since I can't earn my way into heaven, then what I do doesn't matter. That is not what the Scriptures say at all, and it's something that Christ is addressing in this letter head on. What you do matters. It is not enough. And I would say that the American church is as guilty of this as any church has ever been. It is not enough to show up and feel good. Christ is saying, what else are you doing? You have essentially given in to the culture that is around you. In order to give into the culture, you have to abandon what Christ has said is important. So let's remember what Christ has said is important for those who will follow Christ. One of the things Christ is quoted as having said is that the world will know that you are my followers by what? How you love people, right? We've seen that theme already appear in the earlier letters, the first 4 letters that we read. You have forgotten what I taught you. What is it, Christ says, that I've taught you? I've taught you the love of the Father, the unconditional love of the Father, the transformative love of the Father. I've taught you that you cannot earn your way into heaven, which we know. But I've also taught you that that love dictates action. James is quoted as saying in one of my favorite passages that faith without works is what? Dead. Show me your faith without works, and I will show you my faith by what I do. Christ talks so much about love and relationship. On that day, many will come to me and say, you've heard me quote this, many will come and say, Lord, didn't we do this in your name, and didn't we do that in your name? And I will say to you, get away from me, you evildoers, because I never knew you. Right? Christ talks about love and relationship incessantly, but Christ also speaks incessantly about the fruit that we bear. If we love God and are loved by God, then it is Christ's expectation that that love transforms us. It is not Christ's expectation, as I preached about last Sunday, that we go to the top of the mountain, pitch a tent, and stay there because it feels so good to bask in that love, right? Which it does. It feels amazing to bask in that love. But there's more to be done. That love transforms us, and when we are transformed by that love, which is still flowing through us, Christ says there is fruit. What does that mean? What does it mean for there to be fruit? When we are transformed by the love of God, there is fruit that our lives begin to bear. Why? Because that love is not something that's static. You cannot be transformed by the love of God and not be active in what God is doing to redeem brokenness in the world. You can experience the love of God and then spend the rest of your life trying to find and relive that experience, which is what I preached about last Sunday. It's a dangerous thing to pitch a tent on top of the mountain. You'll sit there waiting for God to give you that amazing experience again. What you end up doing is searching for the experience instead of the God of the experience, who's already moved back down the mountain and is doing something else. Now, don't take the metaphor out too far. One of my seminary professors said that every metaphor breaks down at some point. Yes, we know God is everywhere present all of the time. The point to that metaphor is that it was never God's intent, as you heard me say on Sunday, the mountaintop experience is not meant to detain us. It's meant to transform us. We're not supposed to stay on top of the mountain. We're supposed to follow God back into the world so that as transformed people, we begin to participate in what God is doing to redeem brokenness in the world. So what is the problem here? Part of the problem here, and there's another lesson similar to this that we'll get to in the next letter. Part of the problem here is that the people have compromised. Christ says that's not okay. It is not okay to compromise. So we have to ask ourselves, what have they compromised? What is it that they've given up? Well, in particular, what they've determined is that their measure for success, the metric that they use for success, is different than the metric that Christ is using to determine success. So what is the metric they're using to determine success? Wealth, income, the number of people who are participating in what they're doing as a church. Those kinds of things have changed very, very little throughout the many centuries of Christian life. If you want to look at a healthy church today, you will be confronted by two metrics: financials and attendance. And yet Christ says, I walked among you, teaching you that people will know that you're my followers by how you love. Now, we can take a look at the very practical side of doing church, which is what Sardis would have said. They're great business people there. That's why they were so profitable in so many areas of their life. So they're great business people, right? You could come to them and they would say, well, yeah, it's all fine and good, but you do have to have enough money to keep the lights on and the doors open, right? Who are you changing if you don't have people in the pews? Well, there's truth in that. But like anything, it's easy to fall into the trap of believing that just because that's a valid point, that it is the only point, and that from a perspective of priority, it matters more. So here's what Christ, I think, is saying. I'm not sure that Christ cares whether the lights are on and the doors are open. At least that's what he's saying here. Is that important for people like us or any church today? Of course it is. We get to do some great ministry because we have lights and doors and buildings, and that is awesome. And I wouldn't discount that, nor would I discount the ministry of people who help to make that possible. What Christ is saying is, and I think probably Christ would be fine with that. I don't think Christ would come and say, abandon your building is evil. What Christ would say is, you can't place one priority above mine. So what is the metric that Christ uses for success? Is it attendance and financials? No. The metric that Christ uses is who is being transformed, and in what way. How are people being transformed by the love of God? Now, that's a metric that's very difficult to assess, but you know it when you walk into a church that is full of people who have embraced the love of God, the love of Christ. There's a church up in Stillwater called Lost Creek United Methodist Church, just right outside of Stillwater. Their minister is named Max Rudd, and he has been there for, I want to say 30 years, maybe 40 years. He's been a part-time local pastor the whole time he's been there. So he had another job. I think he may have been an engineer, but I don't remember. His church, he is the longest tenured pastor in the Oklahoma Annual Conference, the pastor who hasn't moved in the Oklahoma Annual Conference. Started that church decades ago. It's grown to about 220 some odd people in average attendance, which is good for that part of the state. When you walk into their church for any regular Sunday morning worship service, you will find something that I have never seen at another United Methodist church. All along the back wall, throughout the whole service in that church, the back wall is full of people who are standing with their heads bowed, praying. They pray through the whole service, not out loud, they pray silently, but they stand at the back and they pray through the whole service. If you ask Max what one element caused his church to become as healthy as it is over and above the others, he will tell you that story. I know that story because I've heard him say that story. He will say a praying church is a healthy church because in a praying church you have people who are actively seeking out God, seeking deeper relationship with God, and being transformed by God. And so what you see in his church is a congregation full of transformed people. Now, transformed people do things. And that's what we're going to see in just a minute. Transformed people bear fruit. That's the scriptural way to say it. That's what Christ would have said. And so if we have exchanged one metric for another, if we're judging success like they are in Sardis, based on financial profitability and attendance, then Christ is saying you're missing the key metric. You're missing the one that matters the most. Whose lives are being changed? What lives are being changed? You think you're alive. That's what Christ says here. You think you're alive, but you're not. You have the reputation of being alive, but you're in fact, you're dead and you don't even know it. Yes, you have money. Yes, you have people. What you don't have, Christ is saying, is the love that I taught you, and that is what matters. All right, there's more here, so let's move on. Write this to the angel of the church in Philadelphia. These are the words of the one who is holy and true, who has the key of David. This is a reference to, I believe it was Isaiah, and I think Jeremiah says something about it too. The key of David is the authority to determine who does and does not get into Jerusalem. In this context, the key of David references the authority to determine who does and does not get into the kingdom of heaven. Who is holy and true, who has the key of David. Whatever he opens, no one will shut, and whatever he shuts, no one opens. I know your works. Look, I've set in front of you an open door that no one can shut. You have so little power. This is probably, I got to tell you, that of all 7 of the letters, this one is my favorite because of the theology that we're about to talk about. You've so little power, and yet you've kept my word and haven't denied my name. Because of this, I will make the people from Satan's synagogue, those who say they're Jews and they're really not, but they're lying, I will make them come and bow down at your feet and realize that I've loved you. Because you kept my command to endure, I will keep you safe through the time of testing that is about to come over the whole world to test those who live on earth. I'm coming soon. Hold on to what you have so that no one takes your crown. As for those who emerge victorious, I will make them pillars in the temple of my God, and they will never leave it. I will write on them the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem that comes down out of heaven from my God. I will also write on them my own new name. If you can hear, listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. All right, so this letter deals with some theology that I think is powerful. For starters, this is the only letter of all of the 7 where you don't hear an admonition. Christ is not chastising this church, and that is remarkable. It's the only letter where that doesn't take place. So what we see is that Christ addresses the church, and he addresses them in a very particular way. Just like he has with all of the other churches, he addresses them with an introduction that's very particular. These are the words of the one who is holy and true as the key of David. Whatever he opens, no one will shut. Whatever he shuts, no one will open. Here in Philadelphia, the Christians have been booted out of the synagogue. They are not allowed to participate in Jewish life. Remember that for the first, really for about the first 2 full generations of the early church, they were a sect of Judaism. Many of them, while they saw themselves as followers of Christ and that changed how they practiced Judaism, many of them still saw themselves as devout Jews. And so in many places they were trying to participate in synagogue life, trying to convince their Jewish brothers and sisters that following Christ was the way to go, that Christ is or was the promised Messiah. Because of that, they were often treated harshly, and in this case in Philadelphia, they were kicked out of the synagogue. Because of that, that meant to the Jewish people there in Philadelphia were telling them that they were kicked out of being a part of God's chosen people, which meant that ultimately they would not be saved. So you have this group of Christ followers there in Philadelphia who've been booted out of the synagogue, which is a profound statement because their salvation is directly tied to their security as part of the people of Israel. Now, that theology is changing, will change, and has changed. And that's part of what Christ is saying here. It is no longer because you are tied ethnically to the people of Israel that you will be saved. Christ makes that case here. But he starts the introduction to this letter by speaking directly to their plight. Here's what you need to know, Christ says. I am the one with the keys to heaven. That authority has been given me and no one else. Because of that, Christ says in another place, judge not lest you be judged, right? Because the measure that you use is the measure that will be used against you. There is only one being in all of creation that has been given authority to judge, and that is Christ. That's affirmed in the Gospels, and it's affirmed again out of the mouth of Christ right here. I am the one with the keys. I love that statement because it's powerful. I love that kind of powerful, dramatic statement where God says things like, I'm going to bless you beyond measure because I'm God, and I've chosen to do that. One of my favorite images from a movie is from the movie The Bear. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but it's about a bear cub. There's hardly any dialogue. There might not be any dialogue in this movie at all, but it's about the plight of a young bear cub. So you kind of follow this bear cub through its plight. It is befriended by an adult male Kodiak, which is a strange relationship in and of itself. And that Kodiak kind of watches out for him at times and doesn't at other times. And so there's this one point in the movie where the bear cub is kind of wandering around, and it's spotted by this mountain lion. And so this mountain lion, I should have brought the clip for you, it's kind of dramatic. The mountain lion starts to chase the bear cub, and the bear cub is running away from the mountain lion, trying to get away, and they chase each other around for a little while. And finally, the bear cub makes its way out onto this branch that's kind of over this creek, and the branch breaks, and the bear cub falls onto a larger log. The log is jutting out over this kind of creek or river. And so the bear cub is backing up onto this log, and the mountain lion is kind of stalking it onto the log. You can see even in the mountain lion's eyes that it knows it's got the bear cub now, right? And so the bear cub doesn't know what to do. It's backing up and backing up and backing up, and it's cornered. Finally, the bear cub decides that it has no choice. And I mean, this is a tiny little bear cub, right? So it gets up on its hind legs, and it tries to make itself as big as possible, and it starts roaring, which is like the cutest thing you've ever heard because it's this tiny little bear cub. And the mountain lion, I mean, you can almost see it smirking when the bear cub tries to do this. And then the camera is still on the mountain lion when you see this look of utter fear and complete terror come across its face. And the camera goes back to the little bear cub who's still sitting there trying to roar as loud as he can, but it pans out, and in the creek, that Kodiak is right behind him, standing there, roaring at the mountain lion. There are moments when God says, I will do this because I have the power to do it. Because I have the power to do it, no one will stop me. This church has been persecuted in Philadelphia, and by Christ's own admission, they've been faithful. They're the only church in all of these 7 letters that has been utterly faithful to being who Christ has called them to be, and they have been excommunicated because of their faithfulness. So Christ says, I am the one. You've been kicked out of the synagogue, right? You've been booted from the synagogue, and because of that, based on the theology of the synagogue, that means you can't be saved. You are outside the grace of God. That's what they're telling you. And so Jesus starts his letter by saying, I am the one who gets to decide that. Not the synagogue, not any of the Jewish people in it, or the people who think he's very harsh on them. Not the people who think they're Jews, and by the way, he says they're not. They're doing the exact opposite of what I've said to do, and because of that, they're not followers of me. They're actively working against me, which is why he calls them Satan's synagogue. Christ says, I have the authority. And then, as if to explain that better, just to drive the point home, in my mind, this is kind of where the camera zooms out and you see the Kodiak back there. Just in order to drive the point home, he says, the doors that I open, not no one will shut, no one can shut. When I open a door, Christ says, nobody can shut it. And when I shut a door, nobody can open it again. That is a powerful statement that applies to us today, because it is a statement about judgment. Whatever he opens, no one will shut. Whatever he shuts, no one will open. I know your works. So first he says, I have the authority. Not only do I have the authority, but I have the power. There is no one who gets to decide whether or not you will spend eternity in the presence of God the Father except for me. Nobody has that authority. Remember that. Because one of the greatest sins, one of the greatest heresies we commit is to take on the authority of Christ, authority that we have not been given. No one but Christ has the authority to determine who goes to heaven and who doesn't. Period. So he makes that statement, and he makes that statement to a church that's been beaten up, metaphorically speaking, by the synagogue that they very much wanted to be a part of. And they're wondering, they're concerned, they're questioning their own salvation because now they've been excommunicated and according to the theology of the synagogue are outside of the grace of God. So they're worried and they're concerned. So Christ comes to John and says, here's what they need to know. What they need to know is that I get to decide this. I'm the one who has the authority, not the synagogue, not anybody else, and I know their works. So not only do I have the authority, but I know what you've been doing. I know who you've chosen to be. So look, I've set in front of you an open door. No one can shut it. You have so little power, and yet you've kept my word, and you have not denied my name. What is he saying? Unlike all these other churches he's been talking to, they've been faithful. They've been faithful to what Christ taught. They've been faithful to being, as best they understand it, the people that God has called them to be. They've been faithful, and they've been chastised for that faithfulness by people who proclaim themselves, this is a great metaphor, proclaim themselves to be righteous, and yet are working in opposition to what Christ is actually doing. That is a major word of warning. Because most often, just like in any story, we tend to want to identify with the people who are on the good side of the story. In this case, the poor Christians who've been berated even though they've been faithful. What Christ would remind us is that we need to be careful to assess whether or not we are actually better identified with the other side of the story, with those who have taken on a mantle of righteousness that is actually self-righteousness. We've talked about that in some of our previous Bible studies. There's a big difference between righteousness and self-righteousness. Righteousness comes through Christ. Self-righteousness is proclaimed. All right, so the theology here that applies to us is that God is the one who chooses. God is the one who has that authority. Judgment without complete knowledge and perfect love will always be unjust. Who has that? Christ does. Christ has complete knowledge and perfect love. Christ at the right hand of the Father is the one who has been given authority to judge the quick and the dead, right? So if that is the case, that means that the vast majority of the dialogue that we have today in the church is totally irrelevant dialogue. We are not to be trying to determine who gets to go to heaven and who doesn't. We are to be spending time trying to figure out how we can know God better, embrace that love so that we can be transformed. As I said on Sunday, our task when we come down that mountain is to be a part of what God is doing to help other people find the way up the mountain that God is calling them to so that they can be transformed as well. It is a powerful image, and it is a powerful statement about judgmental self-righteousness. So because you kept my command to endure, I'm going to keep you safe through the time of testing that's about to come over the whole world. That's verse 10, to test those who live on the earth. Most scholars believe that that is in direct reference to what is called the tribulation, which we're going to learn about in a few more chapters. There's going to be a great time of trial and tribulation. So that is preceded by a rapture where the faithful are taken up and they don't have to endure that. Christ is saying to this church, you're not going to have to do that. If you are, now, our thoughts as we read that are, well, obviously those people didn't live long enough to experience the tribulation or the rapture. Well, that's fair, but there's more going on here than that. The statement that Christ is making is meant to be read to all of the churches and meant to be read throughout all time. If we read that in the context in which it was intended to be read, what Christ is saying is that if you choose to be faithful, you're not going to endure what you're about to learn about. I'm going to make sure that you don't have to worry about that because you've chosen to be a faithful follower of me. All right, I need to get us on to the last letter. This is Laodicea. Write this to the angel of the church in Laodicea. These are the words of the Amen. Amen is a word that actually literally means so be it, but it can also mean the end of things. So when you hear Amen, or when Christ says Amen, Amen, it usually gets translated as truly, truly, but in Greek it's Amen, Amen. It literally means so be it. So it's a statement normally of agreement. If I were preaching and somebody said Amen, what they're saying is I agree with what you're saying. But it also can be used in a context that means the end of all things, or the end of things, the final place where the buck stops. These are the words of the Amen. The faithful, the true witness, the ruler of God's creation. I know your works. You are neither cold nor hot. I like this one. You're neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were either cold or hot, but because you're lukewarm and neither hot or cold, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. After all, you say, I'm rich and I've grown wealthy and I don't need a thing. You don't realize that you're miserable, pathetic, poor, blind, and naked. Now, I don't know about you, but if that was the message I got from Christ, I'd be a little bit humbled, right? My advice is that you buy gold from me that has been purified by fire so that you may be rich, and white clothing to wear so that your nakedness won't be shamefully exposed, and ointment to put on your eyes so that you may see. That is a jab. Laodicea is known for their medical school. They produce a couple of salves there, and one of them is an ointment for blindness. So Christ is saying to them, he's taking a little jab at them. He's saying, you actually specialize in making this ointment, and yet you have no idea how blind you actually are. I correct and discipline those whom I love. So be earnest and change your hearts and lives. Look, I'm standing at the door knocking. If any hear my voice. Now, this is a famous statement Christ makes. There have been pictures painted about this. Look, I'm standing at the door and knocking. If any hear my voice and open the door, I will come to be with them, and will have dinner with them, and they will have dinner with me. As for those who emerge victorious, I will allow them to sit with me on my throne, just as I emerged victorious and sat down with my Father on his throne. If you can hear, listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. I know your works, verse 15. You're neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were either cold or hot. So because you're lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth, right? I told you that we were going to get to the other half of this lesson in a minute, in one of the other letters. So in the first letter, we have this statement that your metrics are wrong, right? You're believing the wrong thing, you're doing the wrong thing. Here, we get the second half of that lesson, which is what you do matters. Christ is saying to the church here in Laodicea that you're not doing anything. Your faith is dull. You're lukewarm. There's a movie, I wish I could remember the name of it. One of my favorite movies. I've used this as an illustration a couple of times. It is about, what is it called? The War Room. It's called The War Room. It's about a woman who teaches a younger woman to faithfully pray for her family and her marriage. And because of that, God changes their hearts and lives. So this younger woman is a real estate agent. She walks into the home of the older woman because the older woman wants to sell her home. And they sit down and start talking. The older woman, who regularly prays in her closet every day, she calls it her war room, who regularly prays there every day, kind of gets the idea that there's something going on in this younger woman's life. And so she starts to question her and finds out that this woman is having a lot of trouble in her family, a lot of trouble at home, trouble finding meaning. There's just a lot of things that are out of place for her. And so the older woman starts to talk to her about her faith, which the younger woman is not prepared for because you don't usually do that in secular business environment. But she says, "Are you a Christian?" And the woman's caught off guard. "Yes, I'm a Christian." "Well, how would you describe your faith?" And the younger woman says, "I don't." She's obviously uncomfortable. She says, "Well, I don't know what you mean." And the older woman says, "Well, how would you describe your faith? Is it hot? Is it cold? Or is it lukewarm?" And the woman said, "Well, I don't know. I guess my faith, like most people's, probably kind of lukewarm." And so right at that moment, the older woman says, "You want some coffee?" And the younger woman says, "Sure, I'd love some coffee." So she goes into the other room, is messing around, but comes back with 2 cups. She sets a coffee down in front of the younger woman, and they both start to drink. And the younger woman takes a drink, and you can see her face kind of contort, like it's just not good. She takes a couple of sips. The older woman's just really enjoying her coffee. And so she looks at the older woman and just says, "Ma'am, do you like lukewarm coffee? Do you see this?" Right? And the other woman says, "Oh, no, honey, I like my coffee hot." Christ is saying, I'd rather you be at one extreme, be hot or be cold, but don't be lukewarm. You're not doing anything. You have this lukewarm faith, this lukewarm approach to following me. You're the kind of person, if we were going to put this in modern terms, you show up from time to time, you sit in church so that you can check the box, and you kind of feel good if the message was good, bored if the message was boring, and then you go on back to your life. Christ is saying, because you're lukewarm, I'm going to spit you out. You're not doing anything. There's a theology here that is powerful enough because what he's saying is that what you do matters. It's important, Christ says, that you be the kind of person who has a transformed life, a life that is transformed by my love, that then produces fruit. If you're not producing fruit, what are you doing? Faith without works is dead. Show me your faith without works. I'll show you my faith by what I do. Christ is saying to this church, you're not doing anything. To the first church, he was saying your metrics are wrong. You've decided that the wrong thing matters. To this church, he's saying you're just not doing anything. You're not doing anything at all. And that's not okay with Christ. After all, you say, I'm rich, I've grown wealthy, I don't need anything. Do you see that there's a self-oriented focus there? The church in Laodicea, what he's saying to them is, your perspective is, I come to receive. Now, the church in America has been well criticized as a consumer church, so that's something we've got to own. I come to receive. When I was doing work for my doctoral dissertation, I didn't intend to learn this. I was researching something else. But I read a perspective written by a guy who said that the biggest problem with the church in America is that we have embraced a model that's almost only educational. And I had to sit with that for a little bit. He goes on to say, an educational model of being the church is sure valuable. There's just more that we can do. And I had to wrap my mind around that a little bit. What do you mean there's more that we can do? I'm sure, of course, there's more that we can do. He goes on to say, one of the things we could choose to do is be a missional church. That reminded me of what I heard about value judgments once. Christians in America tend to make entertainment-based value judgments without even realizing we're doing that, right? So I've sat in too many worship services where I've assessed that as being boring, which is normal. If there's a great video where somebody walks around on the streets of New York and says, why don't you go to church today? Do you go to church? No. If not, why? The number one answer that people give, you would think, is that Christians are hypocrites. They don't say that. The number one answer is, it's boring. I don't go to church because it's boring. Well, I'm guilty of making that statement. If I sit and listen to somebody preach and the message is boring, that's immediately where my brain goes. This is boring. It's not captivating. It's not engaging. It's not entertaining. That is an entertainment-based value judgment. Without even realizing that, we're prone to it. What is the opposite of being bored, being engaged, or entertained? So there are other kinds of value judgments I could be making at any place I am, right? If I say something is boring, that's an entertainment-based value judgment. Well, what other value judgments could I use to assess my experience? To this man's point, I could make an educational value judgment. In order for something to be valuable from an educational perspective, does it have to be entertaining? No. I could make a worship-based value judgment. In order for worship to be powerful and meaningful and, let's say, appropriate, does it have to be entertaining? No. So there are different kinds of value judgments I could make. My question in hearing this when I heard it presented was, I wonder how often I make entertainment-based value judgments about all kinds of things in my life, and why do I do that? Well, because in the United States of America, as much as I love our country, entertainment is a predominant value to us. We have more recreation entertainment time than most other cultures have ever had throughout history. So it reminded me of that when I'm reading this guy's work. He says the church has primarily taken on an educational model. Now, I value education highly. I think it's very important. But his next point rang true. We need to be careful that education is not all that we're doing. Education needs to be part of what we're doing, but education should not be all that we're doing. And he said if you take a look at most churches, what they're doing primarily is a lot of education and a little bit of mission. Christ is saying that missional work matters. There are places, even outside of the church in Laodicea, where Christ is at work redeeming brokenness in the world. And so the question in modern language that Christ is asking Laodicea is, how are you participating? What he's saying to them is, you're coming and receiving, but you're failing when it comes to going and doing. So you've got the coming and receiving part down. And he would say a similar thing, a similar message. What was the first church again? Was it Sardis? He would say something similar to Sardis. You're doing a good job of coming. You've got them coming. That's good. You've got lots of people coming, and there's lots of money coming in. You've got the coming part down. It's the going part that you're really failing in. And so if we're going to take a look at this eminently practical advice, one of the questions we have to ask individually, and we should ask it as a church, we should take a look at the whole church and say, all right, what is our model? Are we this much educational and this much missional? What are we doing? But we also need to take a look at that individually. What is my faith life like? Is my faith lukewarm? How is it that I'm encountering the risen Christ? And when I encounter the risen Christ, am I embracing that love, allowing that love to transform me? You're going to hear me say this a lot while I'm here. And then allowing that love to work through me to produce fruit in my life. One of the greatest movements that's happening right now in the church in America is that we're starting to remember that while doing missional activities, working together to be a part of what God is doing to redeem brokenness in the world, doing that together as a church is awesome. But we don't have to do it as a church. I can go out in my life as a Christian and be a part of what God is doing to redeem brokenness in the world. Sure, I can do that together with the whole church, but I can also do that in my daily life. That's what Christ is saying to this church. Then he makes this other statement that I want to finish with. It's a really interesting contrast that we usually miss. Verse 20 says, "Look, I'm standing at the door knocking. If any hear my voice and open the door, I'll come in and be with them." There's this picture we had in my basement of Christ standing at the door knocking. It's based on this passage. And I love the picture. And the imagery is great, is it not? Christ will seek us out. Most people interpret this as Christ knocking on the door to my heart, right? Even though it's written in the context of a church. Christ is knocking on the door to the church, right? Great imagery. Christ is there. Christ wants me so badly that Christ will knock on the door to my heart. Christ wants to be in our church so badly that Christ is knocking on the door to the church. So it's this great imagery about Christ seeking us out. The problem is we miss what Christ is actually saying. The reason Christ says that is not to communicate that He loves us so much that He's standing there knocking to come in and seeking us out. That's a good message and it's true. What He's saying to the church is, you've kicked me out. I'm on the outside knocking. Now, if you let me in, I'm going to change you. But He said, in your church, you've kicked me out. One of the stories, I used to tell this joke. Please laugh. I used to tell this joke the very first sermon I preached in any church anywhere. I haven't told it here. So there is this cowboy, small-town church, small-town community. He goes to this church for the first time. He's just moved to town. He walks in, and he's wearing what he wears all the time, apparel, cowboy boots, some worn-out jeans, button-up shirt. And he walks in, and everybody's very well dressed, to the point that he kind of starts to garner some glances as he's walking down. Now, he's smart enough to know that he's got to be careful where he sits. The worst of the 7 deadly sins is to sit in a place that belongs to somebody else in a church. So he's walking down looking for a place to sit, right? He sits down, goes through the sermon, listens to it, and at the end of the service, he's walking out and he's shaking the minister's hand and says, "Thank you for letting me be here today." And the minister looks back at him and says, "Sir, do you see how everybody else is dressed?" And the guy says, "Yeah, I see that." And he says, "Well, next week, between now and next week, we'd love to have you back, but I'd like for you to spend some time asking God what He believes appropriate attire is for this church on Sunday morning." The guy says, "Okay, I'll do that." So a week goes by, he's been in prayer, he comes back, walks in wearing exactly the same thing, same boots, same jeans, same shirt, goes in, sits down, listens to the message. At the end of the sermon, he's walking back and he gets to where the minister is and he's shaking his hand, and the minister says, "I thought I asked you to be in prayer about what God thought was appropriate attire to wear to this church." And the old cowboy said, I was in prayer about it all week." And the preacher said, "Well, what did God tell you?" And the man looked back at him and said, "God said He had no idea what I should wear. He's never been to this church before." There's a message here for Laodicea, and that is, in striving to be what you thought you were supposed to be, you kicked me out and you didn't even realize it. So Christ says, "I chastise those I love. If you open the door, I will come back in. And if you let me in, my love will transform you." So there's a message there for the church. You know, these letters are eminently chastising, which makes them hard to read. You read them and you think, "Oh man, what are we doing as a church that's causing us to be kind of similar to this?" And that's good. A church from time to time, or probably always, needs to be self-assessing. But there are messages here for you and I. So if I could leave you with a couple of those messages today, they would be this. I would encourage you today to go home, or on the way home, to spend some time talking with God and saying, "God, even if my intentions I thought were right, even in striving to be what I thought maybe you wanted me to be, have I kicked you out of my heart? Have I kicked you out of my life? Am I the one deciding what will get me into heaven? Or have I let other voices tell me what is necessary to be saved instead of you? Have I kicked you out of my life to the point that what I'm doing now is just lukewarm because I'm using different metrics to measure success in my life than the metrics that you would have me use?" And if that is the case, come back into my heart. Sometimes I don't believe that it is necessary to actually say, Jesus, come into my heart. I believe that God knows the desire of your heart. From the minute you want that, God responds. But sometimes it's powerful for us to say those words, just as a statement of transition or a statement of affirmation. God, I want you back in my heart. I didn't even realize you were gone. Now, that's a valuable way, I think, to spend some time in self-reflection. So I'd encourage you to do that. Whether you're here or online, I would encourage you to spend some time today saying, God, in what ways have I kicked you out of my life without even realizing that I'm doing that? In what ways are you standing on the outside to the door of my heart, knocking to get in, and I didn't even realize I had kicked you out there? What will it take for me to open my heart back up to you? I want to leave you with that. I appreciate you being here. Revelation is a fun book to study. It is a powerful book to study. These letters are chastising. The imagery that we're going to be presented with is profound and life-changing. So next week we'll get started on some of that. Let's pray together. Gracious and giving God, I want to give you thanks for being a God who loves us profoundly, a God who is willing to take the time to say, here is what I have noticed about you. Here is what you need to change, and here I am waiting in the place that you've put me for you to let me back in so that I can help change you. God, I pray that you would be with us, that we would never be a people who exchange the right metrics for the wrong ones, who begin to measure success in our lives or in our church by the wrong metrics, but begin to measure success in our life and in our church by the metrics that you've called us to. That people would know that we're your follower because of the way that we love. And we pray that you would never, never let us fall victim to allowing other voices to dictate for us what is necessary to follow you. Let us never fall into the trap of taking on the authority that has only been reserved for you, that's never been given to us. Let us never be a people, God, who are lukewarm in our faith. And if we are, then give us the strength, God, to open the door to our heart again, to let you back inside, so that your powerful love can transform us into the person that you've called us to be. This we ask in your holy name. Amen. Thank you all for coming. See you next week.